Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 25. The Suebi army, under its warlord Ermin, came to the walls of Nitrawa only to be surprised that there were walls at all. A small settlement that had been unchanged for thousands of years had been covered in the spoils of foreign production, and worked stone was only the beginning of this. Still, unabashed by the height and completeness of their walls, the Suebians resolved to bring ladders up and gain entry. After several days they were ready. In this time, the Bosporan garrison force did not show itself or make any effort to disrupt proceedings. This is not because they lacked courage, but because they were fewer than 1,000 in number, and it was plain to see from the size of the Suebian camp that this would not be enough. Furthermore, they presumed that reinforcements must be coming to their aid from all over the empire. I have mentioned before how the reality was that very few people knew this was happening, and even then it was more a rumour than certain fact. On a foggy morning, the Suebi came and lifted their ladders to the wall on either side of the main gate. The defenders made a brief show of holding the gatehouse, then withdrew once the enemy were sure to surmount the walls in irresistible numbers. This quickness to withdraw was because the people had resolved to defend an advantageous inner citadel that protected the temples, and were willing to concede the streets to achieve this. But the expected battle did not take place. Instead, the Armenians upon the walls were frozen in place by the amazement they experienced. They did not imagine that a place in the European forest could look like Nitrawa. I should explain what precisely this entailed. Most towns in this region were of wood and daub, occasionally relying on worked stone for important buildings, although even temples were rarely made this well. There were very few with the skill to make large buildings, and even artisans were not immune to conscription in times of war. These times were many. This resulted in a stagnation of civilization, with the Armenian people as a whole being most concerned with who should get to rule what little they had, rather than making anything new for future generations to enjoy. Imagine then what men who had seen perhaps only 100 masoned bricks in their lifetime would think coming upon the site of Nitrawa. The town was doubtless full of Armenian-style buildings in its outer districts, but in the centre it had been given a large stone agora surrounded by colonnaded temples, including the grand Scions of Gold sacrifice hall, a courthouse, and an inner wall punctuated by taller strongpoints. It was so much stone that it appeared to them that a mountain had been carved down into this shape. When Chief Ermin and the Suebi men saw this, they were not enraged to see foreign practices, as some would have them to be. They were awed by the richness that must have made this vista before them. And below, the townspeople peered up at them in fear, not showing the expected jubilation at the prospect of liberation by men who were like them. This concept hardly applies, as the Armenians did not group themselves into a people or nation in the way Greeks naturally adopted. I think they must also have suspected a trap was being planned for them, since a town that built such grand walls was unlikely to give them up without a fight unless something even more potent had been prepared instead. In this way, a combination of military experience and utter astoundment at what the world was really like in the Southlands gave them enough caution and pause to prevent their advance. The men contented themselves to tearing down the gatehouse, which they found difficult and could not completely achieve, and after the day had passed they withdrew to their camp. The next day they moved the camp to be more distant, although they carried on harrying the roads so that the town remained in conditions of siege. From here, a full month passed. Witness Cleonicus had already stocked the town for longer sieges than this, so a semblance of regular life carried on inside, with the presumption that the king would come and rescue them. Regrettably, this was not the case, for the news had far to go and many obstacles to overcome. Indeed, it was during this month of pause that the king was winning his victory deep in the forests, recorded in my previous chapter. Finally, the Suebi elected battle as a desirable approach, and what mad conferences they must have held to have been stuck in deliberation for so long, we cannot know. Most reasonable would be the hypothesis that they were gathering additional warriors, not knowing what strength the Bosporans could get from their stone citadel, but at least knowing that this deficiency warranted caution. Lesser men would have thrown their lives away to serve blissful ignorance, so I think we should praise the Suebi for their strategic insight. The strategy of the Bosporans was rather sound too. As before, they did not contest the walls. They were also not fully repaired from the previous assault because no one still living there knew how they'd been built. The people were evacuated into the citadel's buildings, while the soldiers lined up on the wide staircase that separated the raised citadel from the town at large. The Suebians could see this formation at the main gate, and at first ignored them. Once they realized that this was the only place the townspeople could be found, Chief Ermin had to whip his warriors into the attack, since the warriors preferred to loot the town instead. Soon a battle was organized, and here the Suebi found themselves at a disadvantage. They came up the staircase and had to fight from 1 or 2 steps below the Bosporans. Furthermore, the Bosporan men could protect their whole bodies with their shields held low, whereas the Suebi had to strain to hold their shields high, not only because of the immediate fighting, but because the rooftops and towers of the citadel were lined with townspeople wielding bows and hurling projectiles. For most of the day there was fighting in this one spot, and every push against the walls of Bosporan shields, the colonial Therios design, resulted in bodies adding obstacles to the steps. The Suebi tried to move these out of their way, yet even while this was done, there were stones and javelins falling down at high speeds. The Bosporans were bloodied too, the wounded filling the square inside the citadel, where a large fire was kept burning by throwing out furnishings from the court and temples. But on balance, the Suebi lost half of their men after the day's attempts and went away miserable. Once there was a break in the fighting, the Bosporans decided that they could not endure the night if the enemy came again, and so they moved everything inside the Scions of Gold Hall and fortified it as far as they could. The Suebi did not attack during the night. When they came the next morning and saw the situation, Ermin permitted his men to go around the town and loot anything they wished. However, it was not the case that the Bosporans were powerless inside their temple. Since the space had been prepared according to ancient designs to allow sacrificial blood to flow into the earth, those men who were too wounded to be saved, along with various small animals that had been herded inside during the retreat, were placed into a careful arrangement inside the hall. The effect of this was that the spirits of those whose power was being digested were visibly seen all around the town, seeming to go about their daily business as they once had. As you can imagine, this disturbed the process of looting the town greatly, and infected the Suebi with a powerful feeling of inadequacy, as their own spirits were crying out in a language the fallen half-men could not understand, begging to be honoured in the same way as the people whose lives were echoing around them. I don't think it is possible for us to imagine how harrowing this experience must be. Since it was simple enough to deduce that the Scions of Gold Temple was the source of these unsettling things, the looters were rounded up by their masters to gather again as a military force in the main square. Inevitably, the temple's iron doors were difficult to negotiate with, and when men tried to climb up the sides of the building with improvised tools, young children appeared at the ledges above and threw stakes and nails down to dislodge the climbers. At a loss for what to do, and unable to leave since that would be cast as a defeat in the tales of the day, Chief Ermin was beset by frustration and exhaustion. After loitering around until it was nearly sundown, hope returned to the Suebi when the temple doors seemed to open. I say seemed because this opening of the door was actually the beginning of a fresh illusion. Since the Suebi hated writing, we have only rumours distant to the actual event, but I shall tell you how those rumours go, so that you're not entirely without hint for what happened. Through the open doors came 2 large figures of a man and a woman, and some name them as Yimo and Manos, as improbable as that is. Their spirits cannot manifest, and will not until humanity and the world respectively are conquered by the gods, which I say is now outside of possibility. These spirits instructed the Suebi that they were descendants of ones who had been corrupted by the jealous gods, and all of their problems would fade away if they only realized what they were supposed to be doing in life. Hardly anyone enjoys hearing their ancestors disparaged, and this was especially true for the Suebi, for whom the knowledge of history was confined almost entirely to the names of their ancestors, and sometimes places they had fought in battle. As much as they hated to hear it, the power and awe of the beings they were witnessing were stronger than anything forest djinns or Himanian godwinds had ever manifested, so it was hardly as if these men had a choice other than to think the message was true. After deliberation, someone asked the spirits what the best thing to do would be. The spirits in unison replied with a single word: die. It was meant in a cheerful and generous sense, I am sure. The Suebi were so terrified that none cared anymore what people would say if they fled, and flee they did in such a chaotic way that some were killed in the struggle and panic. After that, the Bosporans retook the town and its walls, and the Suebi moved their camp even further away, not daring to make another assault. By then, news that there was trouble in their homeland must have reached them, but there was no time to gather supplies and march away, because King Pyrrhusades had made a vengeful run along the secret roads the Suebi had forged to arrive on the scene only a few days after the strange haunting. Having left Aristippus to continue his best efforts winning the graces of foreign tribes with his theatrical court presence, the king was racing south so that he could go to Apollon. The Suebi, for all their well-planned strategy, had now made the mistake of being in the fiery king's path. First, they had been impressed by the defensive works the Bosporans had put up. Then they had been amazed by the craftsmanship and permanence of their important buildings. Then they had seen firsthand how even Himanian peoples were passionately fighting on behalf of the self-righteous foreign gods. Finally, they had seen the images of those gods themselves. To now see the battle-hardened Lithosis wielding the captured heads of their recent victims bearing down upon them, the Suebi must have realized that their lives had been ones of the most guilty errors the world can harbor. So it was that they hardly fought back as the arrows fell and spry horses danced among those begging to have their spirits saved. I do not know how many were spared, but from then on, never again is it said in any record that the Suebi peoples were free within Bosporan lands. To summarize the conflict, the Suebi had inflicted only superficial wounds on their enemy and had been forced to give up their capital city and at least 10,000 warriors in exchange. This was by no means the end of the war, because these events inspired more warriors to emerge and seek action against the oncoming reality of foreign occupation. After this, though, it was the Suebian Confederacy who would have to fear for their welfare, and the Bosporans who would be free to move and stab at their foes across the Black Forest. As for Pyrrhusades, he went and spent many months attending to personal matters in Apollon, and was praised for his dedication to the late witness Diotrephes, inspiring the people with an example of loyalty between one human and another that honoured the cause of humanity as a whole. His usual good spirits began to return soon. The prior military situation had acted like a wave of cold water across his face, rendering him better suited to the trials of life alone, if only because he might invite his enemies to share in his pain through the losses he planned to inflict upon them. This is my judgment of his intention, derived from the change of his style of writing at this point. The Himanians were not to be saved for the good of the world, but to be defeated simply because they were the enemy. One can see that this is clearly unwise, and we are fortunate that Aristippus saw things very differently. We shall return to this. Let us speak of the battles that took place in the east around the same time. In the previous winter, Doreius had detected that the Seleucids had at least 5,000 troops ready at Antiochia Mygdonia. This force had come out of the city for a time, and forced Doreius to scramble to find troops with which to do the same. No action came of it, and both sides returned to their bases without making contact. However, this was overall to the disadvantage of Doreius, since he needed his men at all times to do the most basic of subsistence work in his colonies. Through analysing the lay of the land and what was known of the armies present, Doreius reasoned that the Seleucids had made the feint that winter in order to prevent any army being raised in the spring. Furthermore, the attack would not come from Antiochia Mygdonia, but instead from the north, where the Armenians would disguise the Seleucids so that a quick appearance in the north could be arranged. From there, Amida and Edessa would be approached unawares, but for Doreius having the wit to detect this possibility in advance. He was though only half correct. The Seleucid troops had actually marched down the Euphrates and far out of sight of any Bosporan sorties, perhaps intending to put a stop to Prince Dion. However, the northern frontier was assailed all the same, because the Armenians, under King Ubalnu, had overcome their defeat at Bostra and produced a fresh army. They had managed to achieve secrecy in its mustering, and marched out in the summer of 166 prior, aiming for Amida and then anything else they could claim for their troubles. They were soon disappointed to find that Doreius had come to the very frontier of their territory to stop their advance, as if he had clear knowledge of their plans. All the suspicion this raised among the Armenian ranks only served to weaken them, and they never discovered that Doreius had come to the site of the impending battle essentially by mistake. Soon though, everyone knew that a battle would have to take place, since the two sides had come so close to each other, and neither could afford to let the other leave in peace, even if both were seeking urgent advantage elsewhere. Doreius had established himself in a fortified trading post called Tushpa, actually about 100 stadies into Armenian territory. There is good reason he captured this position without a fight. It was almost worthless. A handful of people lived there then, but obviously it had once been a rich merchant hub, given all the collapsing buildings within its tall stone walls. The eastern arm of the walls were all slumped over, so that anyone could walk in freely. The 3 gates were burnt husks that left the roads impassable to all but the most healthy animals or tiny carts. It was thus hard to defend, and hard for a campaigning army to use as a base. Doreius inspected the walls here and was planning to bring up masons to establish his defence, until he realised that the Armenians would arrive too quickly. Instead then, he decided to use the fallen wall as an anchoring line, since he knew the enemy were guaranteed to attack there rather than anywhere else, allowing him to concentrate his soldiers along a narrow front, with plenty of shelter and protection to the flank and rear. When the Armenian army came, it was like the arrival of some new season, with the morbid greyness of Highland summer coloured with the rich decorations of banners and long tunics the mountain folk paraded in. The Armenians did not encamp, simply approaching in their marching column and forming up for battle, likely having long known that a quick attack against the dilapidated fort would be possible. However, their presumption that they could stomp over the piles of debris and take the fort's surrender was shown to be arrogant. The Bosporans shot arrows at anyone who came close, and so the Armenians brought up their archers on foot and on horse to shoot back. An entire day of this combat saw both sides bloodied, though the Armenians had the worst of it, since they were in the open, while the ruined fortifications were not completely useless to the Bosporans. The Armenians occupied a small village nearby to regroup for the night. At night, though, the Bosporans saw more and more troops arriving to this village, because the Armenian column had been enormous in size. Doreius knew well that there was no place behind him that would survive the arrival of this army, and so his entire body of achievements came to be staked on the performance of a fort that not even bandits bothered to use, let alone respectable armies. It was not too late to retreat. However, Doreius had sent out certain orders which would be spoiled if Tushpa could not be held, and I shall reveal those to you as they become apparent. Arriving with the rearguard of the Armenian army was a siege train that featured Pontic bombardiers. These men built catapults from pieces in their wagons and aimed them at the breach in the wall. There was no shortage of large rocks in the area with which to terrorize any men who stood in the breach, or any who were hiding in the buildings behind. In tandem with this attack, infantry came up to challenge the wall while the Bosporans were disturbed by the bombardment. Doreius was so concerned by the potency of this attack that he took half of his horsemen, around 100, and suddenly rode out of the fort in person, vaulting debris and shouting wildly to catch the enemy's attention. The catapults were positioned off to the side of the enemy's main route of advance, so as to have better sightings to exploit. So it was the case that actually there were no men standing directly between Doreius and the artillery line. The bombardiers stood fast at first, probably believing that the infantry would fan across and protect them. Quickly they realized that those men were too slow-moving to achieve this, hence the catapults were abandoned before Doreius and company arrived. Because of how these devices work, it is simple to damage weak components, such as ropes, to render the whole machine disabled. After quickly achieving this, Doreius ran after the fleeing crews to harry them away from the scene, and further draw infantry away from the battle. After this, he left most of his men in the field to carry on dashing about in a confusing way, while he himself ran to attend to an important matter, which will become apparent the moment I'm able to describe it. Before then, a serious battle for the fallen fort came about. The Armenian body of soldiers were divided between heavy mounted warriors and the massed ranks of spears, who were also carrying very tall shields, which they used in place of armour. When these men came up with strong will to advance, the barrage of arrows the Bosporans could offer was useless. Since what remained of the wall was impossible to defend, the Bosporans ran back into the streets. What I call streets were more like alleys between the old buildings, but they functioned ideally for what the Bosporans had in mind. This was because Doreius had enjoyed the previous combat performance of his Egyptian troops so much that he'd gone out of his way to pay off deserters from the Ptolemaic campaigns to join him, giving him a few hundred heavily armed men who were trained in Alexandrian warfare, that is, the use of the sarissa in close quarters battle. This weapon is almost unbeatable when the formations wielding it are approached from the front, and by blocking the alleys of the fort, the Egyptian men ensured they would have this advantage. Therefore, it was only a few hundred troops who were holding back thousands of assailants. The Armenians did not find it likely that the enemy could resist their tide, so pushed forward until it became their turn to face the gory channels of dead. By then, there was no way to turn back against the weight of the advance behind them. Chaos and death abounded, but it was not entirely hopeless, for men with good armour or fine fortune passed forwards into arm's reach of the Egyptians and slew them with swords, or broke the weapons so that more men could pour in and be a danger to the Phalangites. As the fighting drew back deeper into the ruins, other Bosporan colonists came out to block off the flanks of the battle with their shields, and those with slings and javelins climbed up to high places and inflicted such enormous damage that the enemy commanders were forced to come and rally the troops in person and oversee the battle in its close detail. Of course, this made them targets of the archers still prowling about, and casualties only continued to mount. That is not to say the Bosporans were not losing the fort, step by step, and it reached the point that almost the entire Egyptian force had been trapped in corners and killed through valiant last stands. Then Doreius returned. At his back were some 2,000 fresh troops, and these were not colonial troops, but trained soldiers from Western Asia. It is often forgotten that the Bosporan Empire, if one counts up all the signatories to its military order and allies drawn in through the revelations taught by the Scions of Gold, amounted to a territory that contained twice the number of people and soldiers as the Seleucids and their allies combined. It was only that the war was not fought with strong coordination on account of its slow and underhanded initial course. However, the Bosporan Empire had tens of thousands of men who were obliged to follow the Spartacid cause, from the rich cities of the Lower Nile to the remote camps of the distant wall lands in the northeast, where the once belligerent Alans basked in Manos's creations. Only the Romans considered this reality, and hence their knife was always held behind their back. For the Seleucids and Armenians, the enormity of the task that lay before them would be revealed with bloody alarm in the moment that Euryalus of Pergamon stormed Tushpa from the west with his satrap army. Had the Armenians pressed their attack on the first day, they would have taken the walls and had both positional and numerical advantage to repel the Pergamese, surely ending Bosporan hopes in the region. Instead, on this second day, the Pergamese came in to bolster the fighting with great cries, and cavalry, Doreius at their head, swept along the southern expanse of the fort's surrounds to destroy all the groups of Armenians scouting about there, then proceeding into the flank of the rearguard waiting outside the collapsed walls in the east. This broke the morale of the Armenians, and they began to flee from the scene. First, they tried to get back to their encampment at the nearby village, but since the Bosporans and Pergamese were invigorated by the turn of fortunes and pressed heavily upon the retreating groups, the movement lost coordination. Men ran in all directions to try and escape the vengeful tide that approached, and by and large they did not succeed. The slaughter here was great, although Doreius took many men prisoner so that he could indenture them as slaves to the southern colonies, where labour was direly needed. Firstly, though, the captives were used to repair the fort at Tushpa, and nearby villages were made to submit to this fort as the new regional centre of power, depriving the Armenians of this borderland for a time. The Armenian king reacted swiftly and with wisdom after learning of all that had happened. He came in person to visit Doreius, who treated the enemy king so well that it raised complaints from the soldiery. An agreement was reached in which the Armenian kingdom would be permitted to lease back the villages the Bosporans had conquered, but only if a list of military conditions was met that all but prevented the Armenians from interfering with the Bosporan affairs of the Seleucid War. Ubalnu, having lost 4 large armies to the Bosporan princes, and with the kingdom of Pergamum now seeking to push east at his expense, had no choice other than to break his oath to Kairos and take advantage of Doreius' mercy. In doing so, he also formally granted ownership of the places Dion had taken to the Bosporan Empire, although these were really places that the Seleucids had loaned to Ubalnu as matters of military practicality and organization, so he may not have had the full authority to make this concession. Still, it was hardly like the Seleucids were in a position to contest this new development. Hence, the result of the battle at Tushpa was that a large number of Bosporan enemies were removed from consideration, while the addition of Pergamese men meant that Doreius had a real force with which to press against the Seleucids to further the general war his king and father had ordered him to conduct. The fragile nature of the frontier he had won was eliminated through careful planning, adherence to secrecy and discipline, and such great luck that one could easily understand how the gods were losing their power over the fates of men, once their playthings. Doreius would return to Edessa to attend to other matters in the autumn, and his troops dispersed to their colonies, but he would not dispose of the Pergamese. With more satrap men arriving from the wider empire every day, a just result to the war, shaped to the advantage of all humanity, could be pressed by the great strength of swords wielded in true kingly service.